So good afternoon. I am Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School here at City College, the School of Social Sciences, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our event today, Democracy and Elections in the United States, conversation with Keith Boykin and Maria Hinojosa, which is part of CCNY's Human Rights Forum. We are 2 weeks out from our national elections. So much has happened, so much has not happened. Where are we and what have we learned? We're still figuring out the lessons and the implications of these elections, and that is our subject for the next 75 minutes. 3 things stand out for me as we begin this afternoon. First, we are a nation divided. A record number of Americans cast their ballots this year, 152 million. President-elect Biden won decisively with the most votes ever by a presidential candidate. But 73 million Americans voted for the other guy, Donald Trump. And for many of us, especially here in New York City, we wonder how that could have happened. What does it tell us about the divisions in our nation, among our citizens, not just among our elected elites? That's something we need to examine more deeply. Second, these results reveal, at least in part, that the nature of this nation's divisions are on the same issue that has always been an explicit or implicit driver of American politics: race and racism. And in a human rights forum, that must be our subject. You might hear commentators tell you that the pandemic or the economy were the defining issues in this campaign, and they mattered. But race and racism are among the variables that have the most power for explaining the results. On race, if you look at whites only, Trump wins. It is only thanks to Black and Latinx voters that Democrats gain power in this election. That's nothing new in American elections, but with the demographics of our population changing, this is a big story for our politics and for what it portends for civil and human rights in this nation. And on racism, look no further than to how Trump and the Republicans mobilized white and suburban voters to have fear of cities, fear of immigrants, a fear of Black and brown people, even as they suffered and died disproportionately due to systemic racism. And so as we come together this afternoon, what do these results suggest is likely for policymaking, for democracy, and for human rights in the months and the years ahead? So a good friend of mine wrote to me the day after the election, quote, "Defeating populist authoritarianism at the ballot box is always hard, even unusual, especially in the present historical conjuncture. Let's not let the clouds in this moment obscure the sun or the significance of what was accomplished. In this authoritarian era, Modi won twice, Bolsonaro won, Putin won, Orban won, Duarte won. Yes, Trump won, but then Trump lost. And because of us, the fact that we will not continue a slide into authoritarianism, that we won some precious time to breathe, organize, and reset, it's a very, very big deal. And our democracy held. It did so to create a victory for President-elect Biden with the votes of those who were not entitled to a vote when this nation began, when this democracy was conceived: Black people, brown people, and
hello.
And that's a big deal. So that's the frame for our conversation today. And it is my pleasure to welcome 2 of the sharpest minds on these issues to City College, Maria Hinojosa and Keith Boykin. Before I introduce them, I want to welcome CCNY's President Vince Boudreau. President Boudreau is one of the founders of the CCNY Human Rights Forum. He helped to create it back when he held my position as Dean of the Colin Powell School. His office, along with CCNY's Office of Institutional Advancement and Communications and CCNY's Center for Worker Education, are co-conveners of the Human Rights Forum and co-sponsors of today's event. And I want to thank Juan Carlos Mercado, Dean of the Center for Worker Education, Didi Mozaleski, the Vice President of City College and Executive Director of the Foundation for City College. I also want to offer my special thanks to Danielle Zach, who was instrumental in making today's event possible, and thanks to our colleague, Linda Villarosa, who is friends with our 2 speakers and helped all of us come together for today's discussion. Vince, again, thanks for being with us today. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andy. And want to reiterate your thanks to all the people that made this possible. It's nice to see something that you were involved in all these years ago continue forward under such wise and careful stewardship. It's also really nice, I should say, to see the Human Rights Forum take on American politics. You know, we get into the trap often of talking about human rights and human rights violations as something that happens someplace else. And in America, we struggle around civil rights, you know, a kind of more circumscribed, less threatening violation of everybody's aspirations to be fully human. And I think that's a problem. I think we need to start thinking about human rights violations in the United States. And in doing that, put the United States in a kind of comparative context that allows us to say, Trump is not so different than Putin or Duterte or some of the other people, and really analyze the ways in which American politics is not exceptional, and it obeys some of the same fundamental laws that drive politics elsewhere. And where it doesn't, that's not an invitation to not compare, but to really think about why things are different in the United States where they are, and acknowledge that they're not, even if it's comfortable to pretend that they are, when they're not different. So I really want to commend the organizers for thinking about this election as a forum for examining the possibility that human rights in the United States are in jeopardy. And it's not just a question of civil rights, not that those aren't fundamental as well. But particularly, you know, Andy talked about all of the kind of policy implications of an election in a divided polity, and that's, you know, certainly a fundamental challenge that we face, and it's a fundamental challenge that the incoming administration will face. You know, the book that Barack Obama just dropped then over the last couple of days. One of the things that's so evident in his writing about how he thought about his leadership is that he recognized that having been elected or having witnessed the election of the first African-American president, huge swaths of American society were ripe for backlash. And so he was just so careful at every turn in his presidency to try to keep the union together, to try to keep political opinion centered around consensus, maybe to the detriment of some of his more ambitious policy agendas. But the idea that an election doesn't heal a nation. An election is actually an invitation for us to take all the conflicts and disagreements that we have and channel them towards a kind of referee arena, but it's conflict nevertheless, and it leaves a mark, and we'll be working around that mark for years. But I also think that if we're talking about human rights in American elections, we can't ignore the fact that people who are counting votes today are getting death threats, and you know, voter suppression has moved from the shadows to you know, to a spot where the spotlight is shining on it, and it's being advertised and talked about as sort of central to a strategy to holding on to power, and that you know, quite apart from what someone's policy agenda is going to be, that puts the basic institutions of our democracy under continued threat, now no less than where they were before the election. I also want to just say one thing before getting out of the way for our two marvelous speakers today. I want to talk about the fact of these seminars. This is not the first Zoom seminar that we've had at the college. We've actually been doing these straight through the pandemic, sparked sometimes just by our educational mission, but a lot of times by the murder of George Floyd and our reaction to it, or the divisions that have surfaced during this election and the threat they pose to our democracy. And so I think one of the things that are embodied in the kind of discussion and forum that the university puts out into the internet, where literally anyone with a connection can join, is an execution of our public responsibility at these moments to convene conversations that will matter. And so that means all of the 137 of you currently on this talk that have decided to spend an hour and a half with us. It means for Maria Hinojosa and Keith Boykin, who have spent time with us, and Andy and Danielle and Juan Carlos and everyone, Dee, who helped organize this. Thank you. You are helping us do what is essential, which is continue our public mission under exceptionally trying circumstances. And so you have my deepest thanks, and to everyone on the call, welcome to what I think is going to be a really exceptional conversation.
Vince, thank you. And thanks for both creating the forum, but also continuing to support it so enthusiastically. So let me introduce our two guests. Born in Mexico City, Maria Hinojosa grew up in Chicago. She moved to New York City to attend Barnard College. During her career, she has reported for CBS, NBC, CNN, and PBS, won many journalism awards, including the Overseas Press Club's Edward R. Murrow Award. For the last quarter century, Hinojosa has been the voice of Latino USA, a weekly program on NPR where she serves as both the anchor and the executive producer. She's a 4-time Emmy winner and an entrepreneur, the force behind Futuro Media, a Harlem-based multimedia nonprofit which seeks to amplify voices often missing from the mainstream media. She is also the author of an absolutely fantastic new memoir. I want to make sure everybody can see it. Once I Was You, a memoir of love and hate in a torn America. I read it over the weekend. I highly recommend it to everybody. It's far more than a memoir. It's a statement of the conflicting values of this nation and the complicated and I think sometimes tortured path that she describes of immigrants in making this country greater. Keith Boykin is a native of St. Louis who went to high school in Florida and attended college at Dartmouth. After finishing college in 1987, he spent a year and a half working for Michael Dukakis's presidential campaign. Then he went and got a law degree at Harvard and joined Bill Clinton's presidential campaign in 1992. When Clinton won, he became a special assistant and a director of specialty media. Once the highest ranking openly gay person in the Clinton White House, Boykin helped organize and participated in the nation's first meeting between gay and lesbian leaders and a US president. Over the last 25 years, Boykin has been a prolific author with 4 books, including Beyond the Down Low, Sex, Lies, and Denial in Black America. And this one, which is one of his most recent edited volumes, For Colored Boys Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Still Not Enough. Very, very powerful set of essays. He is a regular voice on CNN as well as MSNBC, CNBC, and BET. From 2003 to 2006, he served as president of the board of the National Black Justice Coalition, a Washington-based civil rights organization dedicated to fighting racism and homophobia, which he co-founded. Both of our speakers live right here in Harlem, just a stone's throw away from City College. Neither of them is here today, but it is still, because of that, at least in part, that it's such a pleasure to welcome them to campus via Zoom. So I'm going to lead a discussion with our guests for about the next 30 to 35 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. I want to encourage everybody to make use of the chat throughout today's conversation. Please share your questions there. My colleague, Debbie Chang, who is the Director of Fellowships and Public Service Partnerships in the Colin Powell School, she's going to assist me with the Q&A period, and she'll pull questions from the chat. 2 last notes. We are recording the conversation for those who can't be with us right now, and we have muted everybody. So with that, let's get started. And Maria and Keith, let me start by asking you, what do you make of the election results? What do the results tell us about this country, our people, and this moment? Maria, you want to go first?
So I think my general takeaway, so I've left the United States, I'm in Mexico now, so I have a little bit of distance, not being like kind of watching the incoming. I think that, especially as a Latina, as you know, there's been this whole conversation about Latino and Latina voters, which is kind of fascinating to watch. I'm not sure how many of you saw or heard about the blowback from The Daily, which is the most listened to podcast, I think, in the country. And their second analysis about about the vote. And what was happening was there an entire hour with 2 white guys who I like, deconstructing the Latino vote and what happened with Latinos voting Republican, which, by the way, happened, but Latinos voting for Republicans has been happening basically since Reagan, at about the 25 to 30%. Remember, the person who got the highest was actually George W. Bush at 35% in recent elections. So let's see. One, I feel like had it not been for organizers on the ground kind of doing the big push to get out the vote, we might have had a different election. Arizona, I was there a decade ago. This is exactly what it looks like when you talk about you're not looking at demography, you're not understanding the future of your state, and you're actually going to make your state more progressive in 10 years because of what you're doing now to be so anti-immigrant in terms of Prop SB 1070. So there was kind of like this, like, wow, people voted, like, oh my God, democracy. You know, I'm a democracy junkie. I like to call myself that. Like, oh my God, people, my daughter, my 22-year-old daughter was the one who was on me, like, what's the plan? She was doing phone banking, something she's never done before. I think that this is a generation whose electoral politics experience will be forever changed. The students who are watching are part of that. You will never think of an election in the same way after living through this. So there's like, wow. And then there's, wow, more white people voted for Donald Trump. You know, it looks like a slight bit more of Latinos voted for Donald Trump. Even Black folks, Black men and Black women, even gay folks. So what the hell happened? That's kind of my initial take. And also, I'm just really glad to be out. I mean, I'm quarantining, but it's really helpful to be out of the bubble of the United States, which honestly has been sucking us in terms of our own humanity. It has been, you know, a pretty intense 4 years.
Yeah, thank you. Keith.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Maria just said, obviously. And I think the last part of it really hit me because I feel like the emotion I felt the most over the course of the past 4 years has been exhaustion. It's just been exhausting every day to wake up to some new controversy, some new scandal, or some new tweet, or another racist tirade, or sexist tirade, or xenophobic tirade. And the sense I got on election night was a sense of relief that even though it wasn't officially called then, it looked like things were moving in a better direction. And so that was the positive part of it. The negative part, I guess Maria also kind of leaned on as well, or touched on as well, and that was that just the idea that after 4 years of exhaustion, after 4 years of chaos and corruption and scandal and catastrophe and coronavirus, after everything we've seen and all the 20,000 documented lies from the Washington Post and everything else we've seen in the course of the past 4 years, that 71 million Americans still went to the polls and voted for Donald Trump to be reelected. That they think that this is a good idea to continue with the president who continues to tell untruths about a major public health catastrophe that is unfolding in our presence. We had 100,000 people diagnosed with COVID on the day of the election, and we have had more than 100,000 a day since the election. We're having 1,000 people die a day in this country because of coronavirus, and the president of the United States had pretty much checked out on this issue for months. He hasn't been to a task force meeting in months, and he still hasn't really talked about it since becoming president. And because African American and Latino people, or Latina and Latina people have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, I find it very troubling. It says to me, when I look at the results, that a lot of people in America don't care about me. They don't care about the health of my people or my community. So I was very disturbed by that. One last sort of general point, which is this. I was disturbed, but I wasn't surprised. You know, because I remember after the 2016 election, a lot of us who were people of color were saying then that that election, the first Trump election, was all about race. But there were a lot of people who were responding to us saying that it wasn't about race, it was about economic anxiety. And people were just upset and frustrated by the failure of the economy to work for them. And I just think that's baloney. And I don't think there's any evidence to back that up. In fact, most of the studies and research I've seen since that time have indicated that race was the predominant factor, the dominant factor in determining people's votes in the 2016 election. And I suspect it will be so in 2020. The point I want to make is the reason why I wasn't surprised is because it follows in the trend of American public history. That if you look at American elections, presidential elections from 1964 to the present rather, after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, after that time, no Democratic president, no Democratic candidate for president has won the white vote since 1964. Not one. Not Jimmy Carter in 1976, not Bill Clinton in 1992 and 1996, definitely not Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, and nor did Hillary Clinton in 2016 or Joe Biden in 2020. In every election, the white vote has continued to vote Republican. And so this is a disturbing pattern for many of us who are not white, because the Republican Party has become, unfortunately, the party of white aggrievement politics. So I just want to start by saying I'm glad that you're having this discussion. I'm glad that you centered it on the issue of race and racism, because for me and for many others who are like me, that's the initial impression we've been feeling since 2016.
So Keith, there was a beautiful article, I don't know. There was a telling article that came out. It was about, I guess, a year post-election of Donald Trump, which I don't think you were surprised by the election of Donald Trump, like I wasn't. When he announced, I said on Meet the Press, oh, he can absolutely be the candidate. And they were like, oh, you're so silly. Like, no, absolutely. We knew that could happen. But the article actually had data, so I don't have it in front of me, that showed that in fact, white America was deeply concerned about becoming the new minority, that the experience under Barack Obama made them feel like they were a minority, and that what they felt like they were losing was their place. Not about economics, to a certain, but it was a question of status and place in society. So it was absolutely about fear. And that's one of the reasons why I do not use the word minority. At my company, which is a nonprofit media organization on 125th Street, even though our office is empty, but we do not use the term minority ever in our reporting, because white America doesn't want to become a minority, because they know how minorities are treated in this country. So what we need to do, but they are going to become a minority. And so we need to reframe. And one way is to not use the term, to be more specific about what we're trying to say, but also to get it out of the way that we were, because also people of color, we are not less than. And the reason why I came to this is not because of like some, PhD political scientist. I actually just had a moment when my kids were smaller, and I was like, I have never sat down with my kids and said to them, sweetie, so you're a member of a minority group and you can go ahead and call yourself a minority? Never. I would never say that to my kids. And so I was like, I'm not going to use it. So I'm glad you touched on that, Keith, because it all goes back to the notion of fear of Keith and everything that Keith represents, and fear of me and everything that I represent, because obviously we have a lot that you all should be afraid of. He's good looking.
Let me ask you to follow up on that, because it was the conversation about race in this election cycle different from what you have seen it be before, either because the demographics are shifting, whites are nervous, even more nervous about it, or for perhaps other reasons. We had some of the biggest national movement building happening over the course of the summer in the Black Lives Matter and the kind of fight against systemic racism. And so did the conversation about race look different this time?
If you ask me, I think it did, because we have lived through the most racist attacks that in one way or another are tied to this administration, loosely if you want. But, having been to El Paso to cover the massacre with a young white boy who's actually quoting what Donald Trump has said, Or we can go on and on. I mean, the Charlottesville, Heather Heyer, and him saying this was okay. So I just think that the conversation, I think in 2015, people were a little bit like, whoa, that's like, damn. But nobody was prepared to say that's hate speech and that's unacceptable and it needs to stop. And so it just kept on coming out and coming out to a degree to which now it's very normalized. And that in and of itself has changed the conversation. So I do not think it's 2016. I think it's much more intense. And on the good side, the wool has been taken off and you have a Black Lives Matter movement that has transformed the entire country. But on the other side, look what just happened over the weekend with the Proud Boys and their ilk.
See, I think of it a little differently. I don't think the conversation has changed that much from 2016 to 2020. I think what has changed is Donald Trump's position. In 2015, when Donald Trump first announced his campaign, he started his campaign with a racist attack on Mexicans, saying that Mexican Americans, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're rapists and they're drug dealers. He started to ascend in his campaign later in 2015 with an attack on Muslims, who the people he was primarily focused on were not white Muslims, but dark-skinned Muslims. And he said that he wanted a full and complete, total and complete shutdown of Muslims coming into America until we can figure out what the hell is going on in this country. And he succeeded in his campaign with a very racist attack. Not succeeded in his campaign, but succeeded in his political sort of success with a very racist attack on President Barack Obama for 5.5 years, denying the validity of his birth certificate. So I think Donald Trump his campaign from the beginning was one of racism in his first campaign. But the difference was that in 2015 and 2016, no one took him as seriously as a candidate. And even after he won the nomination, when Black and brown people were alarmed by this, I think a lot of white people were not as sufficiently threatened by what his campaign or candidacy represented. In this election, I think it was crystal clear. So it became so evident that you couldn't deny it with the death of George Floyd, with the death of Breonna Taylor, with the President of the United States inviting the white St. Louis couple, the gun-toting St. Louis couple who threatened the Black Lives Matter protesters, to his Republican convention to speak, with his repeated overtures to suburban women and suburbanites to come and support him, because if you don't support him, then those other people were going to come and your neighborhoods weren't going to be as safe and as clean and as valuable. I mean, it just became so overt in 2020 that it was less deniable, but it was still there in 2016. It's now become this really dominant threat. So I don't really feel as much of a change that's taken place. I just feel like Donald Trump's position has changed.
What about the Democrats on this issue? I mean, in President-elect Biden's celebratory speech on November 7th, he said, among the things that is his mandate, the battle to achieve racial justice and root out systemic racism in this country. So it was trumpeted that he talked about systemic racism, but there's lots to suggest the Democrats are conflicted on this issue and internally divided on this issue. I wonder how you see the Democrats and their abilities both to react in this moment, but also to contend with this as we go forward. Keith, you want to go first? Your smile makes me think you have something to say.
Well, I'm conflicted. I've been a lifelong Democrat. I'm a political commentator, so I don't have to be objective when I'm working. I work for CNN as a commentator. And I have been supportive of what the Democratic Party has been trying to do in representing the diversity of the country in its party values and platform. But at the same time, it's abundantly clear to me, I'm well aware that the party hasn't done as much as it could, and that it has for a long time taken Black and brown votes for granted and assumed that they would be there. Hasn't really invested in the policy initiatives to make sure that the Black and brown voters continue to support them. And I think that Joe Biden made an effort this year that was appreciated In fact, I have to go back and say this about Barack Obama. I've known Barack Obama since we were in law school together. And I feel like the Obama administration was more hampered and more limited in what it could do about race because he was Black. And in a sense, I feel that Joe Biden could ostensibly, conceivably at least, do more than what Obama was possibly able to do. But the question is whether there will be the will to do it in the party. Whether there will be the will to focus on real, true racial equality. And I just today heard this comment that troubled me from the president-elect about not going after possibly allowing a pardon for Donald Trump or doing something to not prosecute Donald Trump in a Biden administration. And the reason why that troubles me is because it sets a tone of prioritizing peace over justice, prioritizing unity and healing over the need for real, true social reform. And so I hope that that's not the direction that we move as a country, that we just decide we're going to sweep under the rug the problems that exist so we can all pretend to get along, because we will continue to have those problems unless we focus on them, and unless we address them directly and not indirectly.
So I didn't go to law school with Barack Obama, but I went to Barnard and he went to Columbia. He lived in Hyde Park, which is the neighborhood that I grew up in Chicago. His kids went to the school that I went to. So, you know, and I did an event with Barack, and he definitely knows who I am. And I think Barack is incredible. But actually, as you know, on the issue of immigration, this is, I say it's his Achilles heel. It is the thing that he must come to terms with. I mean, I've written about it in my book. It brought me no pleasure to have to say that it's both the Republicans and the Democrats who have thrown immigrants under the bus consistently. I mean, Bill Clinton ran on an anti-immigrant platform and helped start the wall and signed into law all of the laws that were then taken under effect under George W. and then intensified under Barack. So for me, this is in fact, it is in terms of the Democratic Party, and Keith, all due respect that you have been in the party and part of that structure. I don't understand the party in relation to people of color. I've been covering elections since the 1990s. I have been asking these questions and going deep and showing what you know and everybody knows, which is the demographic destiny, if you will, but forget the destiny. The correct political position to take in relation to this country, and yes, human rights. So in fact, Joe Biden right now has the perfect opening. I'm sorry to speak of it this way, but for the sake of what we're doing, okay? Because nothing like this should ever be perfect, okay? Because what we are talking about is human rights abuses. But he has the perfect opening because women's uteruses have been taken from them. I don't know, it's not enough that children are in cages and taken, but now women's uteruses that we know. I'm sorry, to me, as a human being, on the issue of human rights, it stops. Every single detention facility is going to be shut down immediately within my first 100 days. I will reunite every single family. I will bring every intelligence apparatus of the United States to find the kids, because you can't tell me you can't find the parents. I'm sorry. And then you actually even go further. You apologize. I'm still hoping. And you provide mental health, unlimited mental health for those families and children. That would be the decent thing to do. Because what we have right now, people have asked me, because I'm doing so much work around the book right now, and they're all asking me, well, what should be done in terms of the immigration issue and the immigration problem? We do not have an immigration issue or an immigration problem in the United States of America. Let us be clear. Zero migration. from Mexico, where I am right now, to the United States. Are you kidding? Zero, net zero. In terms of people coming in and people coming out, it's a net zero. You have refugees who are desperate to get into the United States. Refugees, not economic migrants. And so this is what needs to be immediately shut down. And this, what I say is that there is no immigration problem, no immigration issue. What this country has, and that's why I'm so honored to be speaking with all of you today. What this country has is an international human rights crisis on its hand, perpetrated by a government and an administration with the specific policy idea to punish and to perpetrate harm by separating parents from their children. It's torture, by the way. We can talk about everything that I've seen in the detention camps. There is torture being practiced right now as we speak. As we are doing this, people are being tortured in the United States of America. What does it look like? Well, they put you into a freezing room the second you make contact with Border Patrol or ICE. They're called La Hielera, the ice box. That's where you go. Right now I'm sweating because I'm in the sun. It's like taking me right now with the sweat that I have and putting me into an ice box. Where's the torture? Where do you see the mark on my body? I was tortured. So, and there's psychological torture. I don't want to, anyway. So the issue is, and this is where the Democratic Party, honestly, I'm going to be very crude. So please forgive me. Excuse me. But they need to grow a pair and stand up for this and make it the party that says it stops with us. But I think I have a bit of an illusion that this might happen. I'm sorry.
Keith, I wonder if you want to comment on that. I mean, we didn't invite you to have to defend the Democrats, but I'm curious how it's less about defending them and more about trying to understand why there is an opportunity that, and actually both you and Maria raised it. Why wouldn't Biden and the Democrats see this as the moment to take a new position and a more aggressive one?
Well, that's the question. You know, the Democratic Party is a very fragile coalition of different types of people and groups of people. And there seems to be a movement among some to preserve the coalition, that being the priority over the objective of creating real social justice and real reform. And that's troubling to me. And this is the party of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar is also the party of Joe Manchin of West Virginia. I mean, these people couldn't be farther apart in political perspective. And so if we were in a different country that had multiple parties, people would have alternate options to choose from. But because we only have two major political parties that dominate everything, you really only have one choice or the other. The Republican Party makes no effort whatsoever, no serious effort to reach out to Black and brown voters. And we have people like Donald Trump going around doing idiotic things, you know, for example, bringing in rappers like Ice Cube and Lil Wayne and the last few weeks before an election in order to try to recruit Black voters, but making no serious policy effort to actually adjust the direction of the Republican Party. And on the other hand, you have Democrats who in theory should be the ones who are supporting these causes that I believe in, but they haven't always been willing to do that, especially when they have power. They've been reluctant to use their power to help the people who are part of their base. So there is this ongoing debate within the Democratic Party, and I've been a part of this debate as well, about whether the party should cater to its base or try to cater to the elusive white moderates in middle America who are supposedly going to come along if we're just centrist enough. And I don't believe that. You know, Donald Trump ran his entire campaign without even making his entire 4 years in the White House without making any effort to reach out to people like me, any effort to reach out to the left, or any effort to reach out to Democrats or Black people or LGBTQ people. And yet he's still able to get 71 million votes. So I think the Democrats can learn a lesson that if we as Democrats focus on our base, if we actually deliver for our base, we deliver for the concerns that people care about, we deliver a higher minimum wage, we deliver health care for all, we deliver quality schools, and we deliver affordable college education, we deliver affordable housing, we deliver a better climate, we deliver criminal justice reform, we deliver voting reform, then people will start to understand why they should support the party, not just because we talk about it, but because we're doing things to make those values become a reality.
And for both of you, I'm curious, is there a way to connect what Keith just described with what Maria explained as kind of the travesty of what's going on in this moment as a human rights agenda? You know, I'm struck by President Boudreau at the beginning saying, you know, we don't talk in human rights terms as it pertains to the United States. That's for other countries. But is there an opportunity here, or is that simply not a language we can use in the United States?
But that's exactly why, you know, that's why I'm so sad that as of now, neither Joe Biden nor Kamala has agreed for an interview with me. And I interviewed all of the other candidates that we asked for. We got, I mean, an hour with Bernie Sanders, like we got the candidates, and they have yet to give us an interview. And you know, Keith, when I hear you speaking, it's like, people have been saying that since I started covering elections with Bill Clinton. You know, go to your base, go to your base. It's Black and Latinos who are going to carry you over, go to your base. And it's 30 years of people saying that. So I actually, in an article that was published in Medium last week, I said, the Democratic Party begins to feel lazy, which is not something that you like to say. But it's just like, oh, really? Like, you can't even, like, honestly, Donald Trump's team, not him, but his team, did go after Latino voters in South Florida and did go after a particular kind of voter in the Rio Grande Valley, which, by the way, did go Democratic overwhelmingly, but they did kind of target. So this is where you need big thinking. I mean, I just received a text that right now, Julissa Reynoso, who is a Dominican woman, very powerful, has been named chief of staff for Jill Biden. She was the former ambassador to Uruguay in the Obama administration. So this is interesting news, but it's such an opportunity for the party to do a major shift. And yet, because of that internal stuff and their own fear, right, Keith? I mean, isn't it really their own fear of losing control of, I don't even think it's like when people say the more radical side of the Democratic Party, because what's radical is women's uteruses being taken out.
Well, but Maria, I also think that the electorate has changed since the Bill Clinton era. I mean, if you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, compare that to the 1990s, and even where we are now, 2020, you see a dramatic shift in the electorate. But in 1992, Democrats had lost 5 of the previous 6 presidential elections. So Democrats were afraid that they would be out of power forever. Reaganism was reigning. They thought that they needed to have a Bill Clinton type third way moderate candidate in order to appeal to Southerners and white voters. That may have had a place in 1992, but there are still Democrats who think that way in 2020. The difference is that since 1992, Democrats have won 7 of the last 8 elections. We won in 1992, 1996, and 2000, and 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020 in the popular vote. So clearly the American public is with the direction of the Democratic Party. That wasn't the case in the early 1990s or the late 1980s. But what we've seen, according to the demographers, is that the electorate has shifted. I think it's 2 percentage points. I can't remember now if it's 2 percentage points or 4 percentage points with every election, that the share of the white electorate declines by, it's either 2 or 4 percentage points. And that is what's changed the nature of where the party has moved. So they couldn't have been that party that I wanted to be in the 1990s because there weren't enough Black and brown people to build that coalition. But now there are. So we see places like Arizona and Georgia where it's paying off. You get Black voters in Georgia and Latino voters in Arizona and others in a coalition that we can actually take some of these traditionally red states and flip them and get people to start thinking differently about the future of politics.
I want to invite folks to go ahead and start putting questions. I think we have an active chat already, but feel free to form some questions and put them in there, because we will go to your questions soon. So I wanted to ask you about Arizona and Georgia, and both what those changes suggest for us about the Democratic base, but also, you can't have a conversation about human rights in the United States and not think about and talk about voter suppression and the efforts that are very much alive. We saw new reporting, I think, in the last 24 hours about Lindsey Graham's efforts to talk to the Secretary of State in Georgia. But where are we in this country on making democracy available to all people? And what should we take from the experience of Arizona and Georgia about how our politics are changing?
I mean, I'm fascinated by those. I was going to say, let's talk about Arizona and Georgia, because, oh my God,
Yeah.
how fascinating. Ohio, people have it's kind of not been the big story that Ohio, for the last, 50 something years, has always determined who the president is. The way Ohio votes went the country, not this time. The way Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania, what? So Arizona is the power of grassroots Latino organizing, mostly because their lives were impacted by SB 1070. These are people who I met when I was reporting there in 2010, who were 18, 19, 17, 16, seeing their parents who were undocumented now being threatened at every moment, and them becoming activists to protect their parents' lives. That then leads to electoral political activism, that then leads to the ousting of Joe Arpaio and turning Arizona blue. Georgia is the power of the Black vote, Stacey Abrams, but really pushed like, what is the rear guard? I guess I don't really play any sports, but whatever it is that push that you're getting from behind, which was Latino votes, Asian votes, the Vietnamese community, the Asian community in Georgia is growing, the Black Caribbean community, Jamaicans, Caribbeans. So you had that deep organizing. And again, I actually think it was organizers on the ground much more so than it was Democratic Party operatives. But I think the silver lining, apart from just kind of seeing this push, right? So the Black vote taking Georgia over the top with the push of these other coalition groups. But I think what we can say, people understand the issue of voter suppression like never before. Mm-hmm. If I would have talked about voter suppression in the year 2000, which of course I was, or gerrymandering or redistricting, people would be just like, what? People have an image now of voter suppression, and they did it in a way that was so badly done, so ham-handed, to use a term that we've used on In the Thick, our podcast, that everybody sees it. And so it's going to backfire on them, I hope, although they are getting increasingly sophisticated too.
I just want to make an appeal for Georgia, though, since that state will determine the outcome of the United States Senate, who will win the majority. That state is still incredibly important, that Democrats do need to win Georgia, obviously, in the January 5th runoff election with Raphael Warnock and with John Ossoff. I also think it's important when we talk about Georgia to think about the other states that are around Georgia. We had in the last election 5 African-American Democratic candidates for US Senate in southern states. We had Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, Marquita Bradshaw in Tennessee, Mike Espy in Mississippi, and Adrian Perkins in Louisiana. And each of those states has a significant African-American population, 20 to 30% in many instances. Those states could also turn blue in the Senate races, as well as the gubernatorial races and in the presidential races in the future, if we can get over this hurdle of voter suppression. And that's been the big issue. There are enough African-American votes in those states, people who do not vote or cannot vote because of a number of different reasons, or have been disqualified from voting or discouraged from voting. If the Democrats can figure out a way to motivate those people and to overcome those barriers of voter suppression, those states could turn as well.
Let me ask just two more questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I'm interested in your thoughts on our democracy. I worry all the time. I teach American politics and study American politics, and I worry all the time about the health of our democracy. And this was a conversation a lot of us were having in the lead up to this election for fear of not just the voter suppression we just talked about, but all kinds of irregularities, and then potentially a Trump victory that would lead us down a path where the erosion of norms and the kind of institutions of our system. What's your overall view of how healthy our democracy is as we sit here today?
I'd love to retake this question on December 6th after the delegates have delivered the official electoral vote counting to see what happens there. I think we are being tested. Under any other circumstance in any other country, this would be, basically seen as an attempted coup. As an authoritarian, borderline, anti-democratic, potentially dictator who's just like, I'm not going to recognize the results. I think what makes me so angry about this particular moment is that, and the only book about Donald Trump that I've read, and I actually recommend it, is the book written by Mary L. Trump, who does a kind of psychological analysis of him, because and we know this in New York, he just destroys things in his wake. It's all about destruction. It's never looking back. It's all about destruct, and leave it in. Who cares? You're just, going forward. That's why all of these unresolved lawsuits forever and ever and ever. And so I am deeply worried like you. I mean, I'm just like, I don't know. And so the only thing that we know is that what we're doing, the students who are on this Zoom, everybody who is having this conversation, me and Keith, we actually, this is what it looks like to try to save our democracy. It doesn't come with bells and whistles, and it looks like this, like voting, like doing this, like civic participation, like protesting if that's what you do, like calling, like we have to become democratic in every cell of our body in order to try to reclaim what we have just lived through. And I hope, and by the way, I'm not, as you can see, I'm highly critical of Democrats and Republicans. So I when I went out on the day after it was announced, I happened to be in Connecticut. What a bad place to be. I should have been in Harlem. But, when I was driving around with my daughter and screaming and waving, in Litchfield County, which apparently went Trumpy, I was not screaming for Biden. I was screaming because it felt like democracy had won, and because it felt like love and human rights had won. But it was a fun hour of screaming, and then I was like, oh my God, let's hope this happens. We are being tested for sure.
Can I just add on what you said, because I like the words attempted coup. I used that on my Twitter feed once a week ago or a few days ago, and people were outraged that I was saying that. But I really do think that if this were happening in any other country where the elected leader of the country refused to accept the outcome of the race, where everyone could clearly see it was a free and fair election, and refused to accept that reality, we would call that an attempted coup. The State Department would be flying down there, sending people to talk about it. We would be organizing a coalition of Democratic partners to do something to stop that. We'd be negotiating for the exit of that leader if this were happening in any other country. So it's an outrage that this is happening in the United States of America. America in 2020. It's an outrage that 70 million people voted for this nonsense, knowing that this was a likelihood because Donald Trump said from the beginning that he may not accept the outcome of the race. So I'm still very upset about that. And I do think that this is an attempted coup that's going on. The only other thing I want to say, though, is that this is not unique to Donald Trump. Our democracy has been in peril for quite some time. I would say since the beginning of the democracy, because we've never really had a democracy. Never had a democracy that represented people who looked like me, people who were African American, or people who were different. We didn't have a democracy that included women in our country. We didn't have a democracy that allowed so many people just the basic right to vote, to participate in that democracy. And now we have a system that we still live under that was created centuries ago, where the person who wins the most votes doesn't even necessarily win the election. And we have an undemocratic system called the United States Senate, which allows a group of people, a state like Wyoming with 600,000 people, to have the same number of representatives in the US Senate that the state of California has with 40 million people. That's outrageous. That's why we have such unbalanced politics. Until we eliminate those systems that remain in place, that perpetuate the status quo, we'll never be able to get to the point of creating the true reform we want to see in this country.
You're both getting a lot of love in the chat. And,
Preach, Keith, preach.
So let's open it up, actually. Let's go ahead and I'm going to call on Debbie Chang, who's been looking at the questions coming in, and invite her to share some questions.
Sure. So the first set of questions is from Adiola. Her questions are, what impact do we think mis and disinformation is playing in our politics? Is there a dangerous connection between countries with heavily right-wing influenced media, the type owned by Rupert Murdoch and others, and the dilution of democratic norms? What has the role of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter played? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the impact of media on issues of race?
Well, that was like a million questions all wrapped up in one. That's a lot. I'm in Mexico right now, and there's been a lot of talk about WhatsApp as such a purveyor of misinformation. We heard all the stories of what was happening in Florida in particular, and actually in Southern Texas, in terms of reaching Latinos and Latinas by using WhatsApp and spreading disinformation. I mean, somebody who I know who was actually a board member of the Texas Civil Rights Project is now a Trump supporter. And when I was talking to him and asking him, like, so what happened? You were a Republican, but never Trump, or what happened? He was like, oh my God, do you know about Biden? Do you know that he's a liar and a cheater and he didn't go to college and he did that? And he just started saying all of these things. And I was like, what are you talking about? It was like a parallel universe. So, yeah, I'm deeply concerned because people like me and Keith are not the ones who are making those editorial calls in at Twitter or even on Facebook. I mean, it's just kind of astounding how they want to wash their hands of this. It's horrifying. And again, it comes back to us to continue to push for some kind of honesty here. This is kind of, I don't stay up thinking about this. And I did fall asleep watching The Matrix when I did watch it a million years ago. So I'm sorry, but this is when I get really feeling like very Matrixy and just pretty terrified. And I'm not sure, in the same way that I'm not sure how you put the issue of divisions and racial division and human rights abuses back in the genie, put the genie back in the box. I don't know how we put this one back in the box.
I'm not sure if you wanted me to respond to that too, or no.
Yeah, Keith, please.
Well, I saw today Mark Zuckerberg was testifying to the US Senate, and Senator Richard Blumenthal asked him if he would be willing to ban Steve Bannon because of his behavior, where he's basically called for the beheading of Dr. Fauci and other government officials. And Mark Zuckerberg said no, that he was not willing to do that. That was not consistent with Facebook's policies. I'm just shocked that that's even a responsible answer. But when you have a country where the president of the United States can convince people that a pandemic that is ongoing, that has taken the lives of 250,000 Americans, is not actually happening. That masks, which the scientists are telling us we should wear, don't actually work. I'm not surprised that we have people who think that the election results aren't actually the election results. The president is even trying to delegitimize Fox News, which has been the most conservative of the quote mainstream news advocates, news outlets over the course of the past several years or decade. He's even trying to delegitimize Fox News because Fox News won't spin his conspiracy theories about the election. And so I just saw a video on Twitter today of a woman, a teacher it was, I guess, who posted an image of a woman who called her to complain because her third grade son had to make a map of who won the red states and the blue states in the election. And the map showed 306 electoral votes for Biden and 232 for Trump. And the mother called up the teacher to complain that this map is not accurate and said, if you watch OAN, which is outrageous, not even acceptable far-right news network, that you'll see that we have 6 states that haven't even been called yet. So we have people in this country who still believe that this election has not been decided because the president of the United States continues to traffic in these lies and nonsense. So I fear for our country, and I fear when we have these information silos that people can find themselves trapped into in these bubbles. They don't get the information that they used to have. It used to be, and I'm old enough to know that back in the day, I didn't like the idea of having the news gatekeepers and media gatekeepers, but I knew that everyone had sort of the same framework of information. You knew that the 3 nightly news anchors or the major newspapers would give you some sort of basic information, and you could go from there and decide what your politics were. But today, you don't even have to tune into that. You don't have to know what the mainstream story is, because you can have your own version of reality that is completely disconnected from what's happening in the world.
And part of what we have to recognize is that, one of my battles has been with my colleagues in the mainstream media, of which I am a part of, but also outside of. I'm on MSNBC, not as a paid contributor, and I appear on CNN again. So I'm a part of that, but also on the outside. But as you know, Keith, one of the things that has been really, really hard is to watch how mainstream media normalized this presidency too. How do we handle that? I mean, I asked the editor-in-chief, Marty Baron of the Washington Post, I said, how am I, a Mexican immigrant journalist woman, how am I supposed to cover a Donald Trump administration objectively? He started by using hate speech. You don't want to recognize that it's hate speech? That's your privilege. That's your white male privilege. And I had to say, it didn't bring me any joy. By the way, I don't like saying these things, but for someone like Marty Baron, for example, white supremacy, I mean, he may not like it, but it's not going to affect him the way it's going to affect Keith or me. And so the way in which the mainstream media just approached everything like, well, the president said today, or blah, 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 or this, the media was carrying on the role of a kind of normalcy, whereas Donald Trump was busy destroying everything. And so what is the responsibility of doing that? And I think, what the great leaders of American media, all of whom are, by the way, white men of privilege, straight, by the way, they should have been traveling to authoritarian regimes and speaking with journalists about how they cover and what not to do. So not to repeat, because actually human rights are more important than your selling of your newspapers. It takes a whole mind shift, right? I learned this word called peace journalism in Kenya, actually, where journalists had to understand we have to practice peace journalism, because what we practiced before was that kind of biting journalism, and that led to a massacre after the election of 2007, where people took to the streets with machetes and were killing each other because we were fanning those flames. And the media, I mean, I haven't been back since 2007, but at that point, they really, in 2009, when I was there, they were really thinking like, well, we have to change. We have to practice peace journalism. Now, Keith, the question is, what do you think? Do you think Jeff Zucker or, etcetera, Cesar Conde are going to sit down and just be like, yeah, let's practice peace journalism? If there was a market conversation that would allow them to win at that, and even at Fox News, I think, like if you could get to Rupert Murdoch and make that kind of a play, like, don't you see, that's going to be the money shot in the end, they would make that to make money. But meanwhile, we're stuck with what I think was really, we're going to suffer a lot for what our mainstream media did and how they did not help.
Thank you. Debbie, another question.
So the next question is from Katie. How do we end systemic racism without galvanizing the Republican base into voting in another Trump in 2024? So Katie totally agrees that Democrats need to stop pandering to Republicans and actually stand up for racial justice. But how do we do this without pushing people further right?
I think we have to accept the fact that people already are there. We already know there's 71 million people who voted for Donald Trump. I think it's not realistic to assume that those people are magically going to transform their opinions in 2024. So the question is, how do we get more people out to vote who believe the same thing that we believe in? The people who believe in progress, people who believe in equal opportunity and equal rights for everyone. So I don't think that the Democrats should spend too much time, if any time, being worried about what the Republicans are going to do. And I think that's been the critical mistake the Democrats have made in the past. I think the Democrats should focus more on getting their own people out to vote and then giving them a reason to vote as well. I know that's a very controversial opinion for some reason, the Democratic Party, but that's what I believe.
We can take another question just so we can have more in the mix.
Sure. So Bruce has a question, which I'm going to read verbatim. He says, we have to stop using tolerance, a term of physics regarding how much stress can be taken until collapse. No one goes through life seeking to be tolerated. Instead, we need understanding, which requires paying attention and need not result in liking or loving anyone or any group, but have a sense of what makes them tick, how they experience the world. Black Lives Matter, particularly with the public murder of George Floyd, may have been such an opening. Any thoughts on that?
I'm all about that. I mean, that's what for me has been the hardest thing of the pandemic, is not being able to be out and about. I believe in democracy with the big D, the capital D, as well as with, oh my God, you worked with Victor Penchasade. Oh my God, Diana Puñales. Oh my God, she just texted me. I'm sorry, she just chatted me and she mentioned somebody who was at the birth of my son and my daughter. So it's not just anybody. But anyway, we have to form these human connections. This is what's so hard for me, is that, normally I was out traveling the country, right? And talking to people, engaging with people in the hotels and the college campuses and the lifts that I was in, and trying to do just that, which is, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to try to understand you. It's not about tolerating, but it is trying to attempt to understand. I see this as kind of our civic responsibility. I'll just end by saying, like, I had a conversation with a cab driver in Chicago. It was, maybe at the end of 2019. And he was like a white guy in his 50s. And he said that he voted for Donald Trump and that he loved Donald Trump because Donald Trump was motivated by love. That Donald Trump's only motivation was motivated by love, that he had so much money, he didn't need anything. And I was like, bro. And I listened for the entire 45 minutes as he told me. And then after I listened, I said, well, let me tell you a little bit how I see it. At the end, when he dropped me off at the airport, he said something about, well, it's just how something about Jesus. And I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but Jesus wouldn't be allowed in the United States right now. And think about me, because I'm a Mexican immigrant. I was born in Mexico. He could deport me. And at that point, this man just looked at me and he said, oh my God, no. Can I hug you? To which I said, of course. And it ended in a hug. So I believe in this very and I also believe in what Keith says, which is there are some people who we will not be able to reach. Will not. Some of them, I'm just realizing, are my own family in Mexico who are Trumpy in Mexico. I'm not going to be able to change my 94-year-old Tia. It's like, okay. And so I think it's about the next generation and young people and owning our responsibility, which is why I applaud Keith for all of the work that he's done and all of the books that he's written and all of those appearances that he's made, because that is, in fact, what democracy looks like.
I just make a quick comment to add on to that, Maria. As a gay man, I've heard this tolerance word for so many years, and it's a very disturbing word because it's never about acceptance. It's always about, we'll tolerate you or we'll pray for you, but it's always a tacit sense of condemnation that you get from that word. And so I've never been one who's like that term. And I think one of the things I learned from the LGBTQ community is the issue of marriage equality. If you go back to 2008, Barack Obama didn't support marriage equality. In fact, most of the Democrats supported civil unions at that time. They didn't support gay marriage. But it wasn't until, I think, after the activists kept pushing it and the courts kept moving it that the leaders started to move. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is don't be limited by just where the public opinion happens to be at that moment. You have to shape and create public opinion. You can't just put your finger in the air and see which way the wind is blowing and decide we can't push on this issue because it's not popular. If you believe that something is right, and it's motivated truly by love, truly by equality and helping people, then by all means, we should advocate for that, irrespective of what the consequences may be politically, because if you don't articulate that, then you'll never have a chance for people who believe that to even get to that stage.
Thank you very much. So we're reaching the end of our hour. And before we finish, I want to move off elections and just ask a last question, which is, you've both been path breakers. You've both been role models. You've accomplished firsts in your field. And, City College is a place where more than 70% of our students are first in their families to go to college. We have a lot of people who are firsts in this audience, but coming up behind you. And as they look at the two of you and wonder, how can they do this? What would you say to them? How can they be successful in their chosen fields? And what advice would you give young people right now for how not to get discouraged from everything we've just talked about, and for how they should find their voice and find their power?
So I will just say, because I'm Mexican, I have 16 jobs. I'm also a professor at Barnard College, my alma mater. So I am with young people. A couple of things. So first of all, I hate to tell you this, but there is no nirvana. Those of us who are over 40 on this call know that that's what we're like. You don't get to a point in your life where you're like, oh my God, it all fits perfectly now. Whew, no, your life is constantly evolving and changing, so you need to not be afraid. I think many of us want to have that sense of, it's all going to fall. It will. You need to convince yourselves of that. Also, so you need to talk to yourselves, make sure no one is hearing you, but convince yourselves of the badasses that you are. You need to own this moment and own your voice. All I can tell you is one of the things that I do, particularly in my classes, is I bring people to speak who do not have a straight line trajectory, so that you can understand that it will make many twists and turns, but you need to believe in yourselves, and you need to be the badasses and walk in with your shoulders back and like you own everything, because you do. Come on, you're from New York City College. Hello. Not that what you have from there is the thing that's going to make you succeed. But you're going to have to convince yourself, is all I'm telling you. It's not like you're going to have a lot of people like propping you up. And so you need to find your troop, find your people, and convince yourself that you are extraordinary, because you are. You're already on this call. You're already right there with us. So you're gonna make it.
I agree with everything Maria said, and I'll just add two of my favorite poets. One, Robert Frost, and the other, Audrey Lorde. And Robert Frost wrote that two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I came across that poem at Dartmouth College when I was an undergraduate student, and it really inspired me to not do what everyone else was doing, to follow my own path. I didn't do the traditional path of what people do after college. I didn't go work for a big corporation. I went to law school eventually, but I worked in political campaigns because that's what I wanted to do. I worked in 6 consecutive failing political campaigns before I got to a campaign that actually won anything. So, you just have to keep struggling, keep fighting for what you believe in. The second poet, of course, Audrey Lorde, is a little different. She said, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less important whether I am afraid. And the reason why I like that is because she doesn't say you won't be afraid. She just says it's less important if you are. So I think it's important to have a vision, to articulate a vision, to know where you want to go, what you want to do in some general respect, not specifically of this goal at 25 or this goal at 30, but some general direction of what you want to do with your life and how you want to live your life. And don't be afraid to pursue that. And if you are afraid, do it anyway, and know that by doing it, you'll become less and less fearful because it's consistent with your vision. So those 2 messages have helped to steer me forward in a time when it hasn't always been easy. It's not easy when you're creating your own path and there's no one to tell you what to do or no instructions or directions. So I wish you the best of luck. I wish you courage. And I wish you success.
But you know what? To just top on that, Keith was saying it's not easy when you do this independent thing and you figure your own path. But guess what? It's also not easy in the corporate America, the whatever, that safe thing. It's not always going to be easy there too. So follow your gut.
Great advice. And a really wonderful conversation. Thank you both very much for your insights and for your candor. I want to thank Debbie Chang for her help with the questions. I want to thank our audience. We've had a wonderful discussion and a spirited one going on in the chat and excellent questions, many of which we weren't able to get to, I'm sorry. I want to thank, again, Danielle Zach, Linda Villarosa, Vice President Didi Mozaleski, Dean Juan Carlos Mercado, President Vince Boudreau, all of them for helping to make this event possible. And I want to thank at the Colin Powell School, Abby Fader-Kane, Ashif Hassan, Bernice Suarez, Namrata Gupta, Ricardo Inez Carrascal. Just a quick message maybe to follow up on the good advice that we just ended on, which is, and it's one especially to our students, and that is please stay interested, stay curious, and continue to stay or get yourself involved in our politics, that the politics matter. It's just starting. The elections are mostly over, we hope, but we have a long way to go in the fight for civil and human rights in the United States. And with a new president, there are openings. It's not going to be easy, but for those of you who care, find your energy, remain attentive, find a way to be a part of making change. And we're here to help. We're here to support you. We will have your backs in this. So Maria Hinojosa, Keith Boykin, thanks again. To everyone, have a great evening. Have a wonderful night. Take care.